Thank you so much. I'm very excited to be here. I haven't been to New York in a few years, and I chose the perfect time with the snow. In Seattle, we don't actually get a lot, so it's been a bit of fun for me. So as Mazzy mentioned, I am from Microsoft. I've been there 10 years, and really I've spent almost my entire career working on everything you could imagine JavaScript related. And so in this talk, what I want to do is focus on one specific kind of vertical of JavaScript, and that is Node.js, and how its position at kind of the forefront of cloud development, whether you're doing on-prem or actual public cloud, but really the patterns that are leading and forming the trends that are changing the way we're building high-scale applications, and really how we're seeing people do very interesting stuff with it, many of which are folks that are going to be speaking tonight. So first and foremost, I wanted to do a little bit of framing of Node.js. Why is it that people, and enterprises specifically, are choosing it? What makes it interesting versus Python or PHP? And a few people, many of which very frequently when we talk with folks at Microsoft, will say that the productivity that they're capable of achieving when using Node.js is higher than they could with something else. And a lot of that comes from two things. One, there's a very low ceremony to Node.js and its ecosystem that enables you to prototype or get something up quickly. But also the ability to have so-called full-stack developers, where folks that already had web experience or JavaScript experience that now can go do back-end development, or the front end to the back end, as sometimes we discuss, makes the velocity that they can achieve very quick. Second, there's really no ecosystem that exists at the scale of JavaScript or Node.js. Right, when we talk about NPM, it's one of the biggest package managers that exist. When you look at the number of PRs that are sent on GitHub, no language tops JavaScript, much of which is Node.js. Same thing with Stack Overflow. So when you're looking in the pool of thought leaders and technology and interesting trends, JavaScript is always at the forefront there. And finally, besides the front-end web and Node.js, the backend, the ubiquity of JavaScript, the language, is also unparalleled, right? Whether you're doing front-end web development, backend, desktop, mobile, IoT, bots, your skills as a JavaScript developer scale all of those things. The same cannot be said for any other language, right? And so really those are the things that tend to show up a lot when we talk with folks, and they want to know, why is it you're using Node, right? And so in general, if you were to make a bet, so to speak, on JavaScript as a stack versus the other options, probably not a horrible idea, right? Now some of you might say, oh, well, for really high performance stuff, JavaScript will never be sufficient, and that might be true, but with things like WebAssembly and other technologies, this isn't a static point in time that's never going to improve. The performance of JavaScript is continuing to grow alongside the productivity gains. And so really that's why it's becoming very, very attractive, particularly even in enterprise and financial scenarios. Now the challenge is that JavaScript and Node.js and the ecosystem around it, as I mentioned, has a high productivity capability. But that alone is not enough to achieve a lot of the business goals that many enterprises have today. And so one thing that we've heard a lot of and is extremely trendy and is a buzzword that we all have to know is this concept of continuous delivery. And really the concept behind that is the need to move fast, right? I love this quote from the SoundCloud or the Intercom guys that anytime you have work that an engineer has built and isn't getting in the hands of a customer, it's just accruing this kind of debt that emotionally drains you, and it impacts morale and it impacts potentially your bottom line because there's somebody else that could ship it quicker. And so the need to move fast is greater than it ever has been, right? And so in addition to Node.js and the JavaScript ecosystem, there's a broader community of folks that are starting to really address these interesting problems from a broader perspective. So I'm on the Visual Studio team, so of course I'm name dropping here. But one thing that we've found is that as new trends and new problems arise, the developer tools have to grow with them, right? You can't use the same tools, the same processes that we did to build a GeoCities website or a very simple REST API as you can if you're now moving into a different environment that has very different constraints. And secondly, when you're talking about moving quickly and moving confidently, because nobody wants to just keep shipping garbage, you want to actually be confident that it's good, this need for a very portable application artifact that you can deploy regardless of the cloud, regardless of the type of compute, becomes critical, right? VMs are amazing, but there never was a standard VM format that you could deploy to any arbitrary target. And so containers and Docker really have introduced this panacea of reality by which if you adopt this format for deploying your apps, you can almost deploy that to anything. And more technologies are embracing Docker because they have to. And then finally, the need to have smarter deployment targets that are based on OSS and therefore have the support of a massive amount of people with different use cases, and therefore ensuring that the quality of the product is higher, is also becoming very critical. And so once you've adopted containers, now it becomes very natural to say, hey, how can I deploy this container to an environment that will make scalability and high availability and failover much easier? And in fact, there's another trend that you may have heard of, this concept of serverless, that is really taking that even further of, I don't want to have to think about scalability at all. I want to just deploy maybe something as simple as a JavaScript function or an application and have it entirely scale based on the needs of the application, which could be all the way to 0. And therefore, if I have no traffic, it costs me nothing. And so we're really seeing a lot of trends moving in this direction of making it simpler, not just to build simple full stack, Angular JS applications, but really high scale applications. And it's very exciting. And the thing that we continue to find is that even though none of those previous technologies are Node.js specific, it's so common that you see Node.js at the forefront of those conversations, or that JavaScript is pushing the boundaries and the requirements of the technology that is ultimately serving our industry as a whole. Okay, so what I want to do is kind of go through some demos, some things that we've been working on to kind of help and assist in this space based on trends that we've been seeing. So let me figure out how to get this thingy, because I'm going to need my hands. Okay. So as I mentioned, I get to work, I have the privilege of working on quite a few different products, but one of which that I'm particularly very passionate about is Visual Studio Code. So how many of us are familiar with this already? Okay, a good amount. That's interesting. I said exit. So for those that aren't familiar with it, what it is it's a cross-platform open source text editor. And we really recognize the need for cross-platform solutions because, as I mentioned, we're a more diverse workload than ever, and therefore the need for Windows, Linux, Mac OS is super critical, right? And so one thing that we believe in very strongly is that your developer tooling should very much work with you completely out of the box. So let me increase that. Does that look fine for the folks in the back? So this app, this is Visual Studio Code, is a Hello World to-do app. In fact, I'm not going to show anything interesting because there's amazing application demos coming later, and I'm going to just focus on the tech. And one thing that we want and recognize the need for in Visual Studio Code is easy authoring and debugging that just works without you having to do anything and regardless of the OS. So imagine in this app, this is a Node.js app. You open it up, and immediately, if I start typing app, this is an Express app. And you notice that without having to configure anything, I automatically get auto-completion on the API for this library. In this case, I can see that it takes a string, etc. If I come up here and I type Mongoose, which is another very common Node.js library, once again, I get the same experience where I can type through, I can explore the API, it removes me from having to jump to the documentation immediately for simple things. And in general, this kind of experience can help make us even more productive beyond just what Node.js itself and the ecosystem provides. So let me go ahead and just drop in something there. Now, another thing that we see a lot of is folks having difficulty and interest in wanting more turnkey debugging experiences. So in this case, once again, I haven't done anything with this application. I want to just set a breakpoint here on this line, and I'm going to hit F5. And what it's going to do is run the app. Oh, I need to run npm install. I never did that. So within VS Code, it's a lightweight editor, but we have a few things that we have introduced to kind of reduce the amount of context switching. So I'm just going to run yarn. For those that aren't familiar with it, it's an alternative client to NPM that I particularly use for demos because it is much faster. So I'm not just trying to be trendy for the sake of it. OK, so now let me go back and hit F5. This is going to run the app in debug mode, and it's going to immediately hit that line of code. And so here I can hover over any variables. As you might expect with every debugger that's ever existed, I have my variables, I have my call stack. I can go to the debug console, and I can type an expression to evaluate with which, once again, I get IntelliSense. But the point is that I didn't have to actually configure anything. And so this app was able to be editor agnostic, cross-platform, but it enabled the kind of light up productivity experiences that can be very helpful for developers. Now this is a Node app, so what I want to do is, I talked a lot about full stack. And so the front end is also very important. But instead of showing off a front end web app, I figured, well, what about an open fin app? Wouldn't it be great if you had the same kind of productivity enhancements for building a desktop web app? And so here, this is the OpenFin app that you would get if you had just generated the app from the template that they provide. And so once again, I'm going to come here, and I'll do a dot after this. And you'll notice that I get auto-completion on the fin.desktop API, which is great, because even though their documentation is amazing, some people might find that this experience of exploration is just more productive. And so that's really cool. Now, once again, it actually isn't limited to just JavaScript. So the manifest file that you define the characteristics of your OpenFin app is this JavaScript file. And if I want to come and explore what kind of attributes can I have in my app, I can have a default centered, I can have a default top, I can see a description. If I tab that, I can see what the default value is. So in this case, it's 10 pixels. And so those kinds of things make it, as we've seen in working with folks, just a little bit more productive, right? Now finally, as I showed the debugging experience, let me bring up, so once again, as I mentioned, this is the Hello World OpenFin app. Boom. And just like I did with the Node.js app, I'm going to come back here, and I'm going to hit F5. Failed to save. OK. I don't care about that. Sure. So I hit F5, and you notice that I'm now in debug mode. So let me go into this JS file. Once again, I'll set a breakpoint. And that's interesting that it got hit. If I bring back open the app and hit reload, here we go, it paused, right? So OpenFin, one thing that's really cool is it actually lets you launch the Chrome debug tools from within the app. But we found that a lot of folks find it a little bit more productive to be able to do integrated debugging, set breakpoints in their editor. That way the context that you have with your code isn't lost, right? And so what this is just helping to illustrate is that as our applications become multi-tier, multi-platform, mobile, desktop, backend, that having tools that can support that are really important. And we believe in wanting to help support that, and OpenFin is a great technology. OK, so let me jump back over to the Node app. And one thing I want to talk about now is containerization. So as I mentioned, there are lots of cloud services that enable you to deploy source code. You can take a Node.js app, push it up, do Git deployment. It will pull that down, run npm install. And for the most part, that is a very repeatable process. But there are always those cases where the artifact that you're deploying between dev and QA and staging and production is not the same, right? And so the benefit that Docker and containers in general provide is that repeatability, that portability. And so one thing that we've found is there's a lot of interest in folks to embrace Docker, but there's a challenge in getting started with it. And so what we also wanted to look into is how can that on-ramp of getting started with containers be simplified. So I'm going to come back to the Node.js app, which once again is just a Hello World app. And I'm going to say Docker, add Docker files to the workspace. It's a Node.js app. The port that it listens on is 8080. And what that has done is generated for me the bootstrapping of a Docker file that is appropriate for this app and for Node. Now, once again, we get IntelliSense We can hover over these properties. It'll tell us what they are. In fact, if we come here and say mheart slash, so let me back up, Alpine node, we can get IntelliSense on that. And so that kind of helps assist us in authoring and kind of onboarding to Docker because it is a very big learning curve. Now, once you have a Docker file, the next thing you have to do is build it, right? Just like a zip or any other deployment artifact, you have to, wow, I'm really sorry. Like, I'm literally not touching anything. And so once I've done this and I've customized the image I want, which in this case, Alpine Node is just a very slim version of a Node.js image, I'm going to go and say Docker build image. I'm going to select this file, and I'm going to call it, my Docker hub name is lost in tangent, so we'll call it that /node. So go ahead and build that. And once again, as you can see in the terminal, all that those commands that I'm running are doing is shelling out to the CLI. So it's not that it's trying to abstract away from the core skills that you would need to really effectively use Docker, but hey, we can make this simpler, right? That productivity, that need to move super quick. Every gesture in ergonomics is key. So we've built this, so what's left? Let's go ahead and deploy it. So we'll say Docker push, say lost in tangent node, that's the one we just did. And so that's going to go ahead and push that image up to Docker Hub. Now the beauty is once you've containerized your app, as I mentioned, you can now deploy this to a vast array of public clouds, PaaS providers. You could spin up a VM that you have Docker on there. And so your options become bigger than they ever have been. And so let's kind of demonstrate a few examples of what that looks like and what I mean there. Let's see, where'd my terminal go? So in Azure, we have quite a few services that range really from the level of complexity and maturity of the app itself. And so one of them is called App Service, which is a traditional PaaS, a platform as a service. And really that's trying to be very opinionated, help make the on-ramp as simple as possible. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to say 8, and this is our Azure CLI. Wow. It's going to be a fun night if it keeps doing this. Or maybe it's a Mac problem, who knows. So, yeah. Actually, I mean, I'm not a Windows guy, so just because I'm from Microsoft, that was not a subtle jab at Mac, honestly. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, hey, using the Azure CLI, provision me a web app, and I'm going to call it Fin.js demo. And what this is doing behind the scenes is provisioning the necessary cloud infrastructure necessary to host this app. So then what I'm going to say is app service web. Let's configure the container of this app to come from, and forgive the wrapping, it's not avoidable with this giant font size. So what I'm saying is, go ahead and take that Docker container that I just deployed to Docker Hub, which I built in VS Code, and use that as the source for which this app is actually deployed, right? So then we'll just say app service web browse. Let's bring it up. Let's see what it looks like. I just deployed the thing, so I want to see it. And there it is, right? And it actually is spinning because I haven't done anything with the database. But that doesn't matter, because we're talking about stateless node apps. Like running databases, clusters is a whole other topic of conversation that's best had over drinks, as the guys from TT will tell you. So that's cool, right? So we took an app, we containerized it, we deployed it to a PaaS. What else can we do with this thing, right? So in this case, app service is an Azure-specific PaaS. And so, for better or for worse, by using it, there is a bit of Azure lock-in. Now the benefit is that I only had to do a few CLI commands, and then everything else was a standard Docker container. But as I mentioned earlier, one thing that's really taking off and has a ton of value are these open source container orchestrators. And so what we're talking about is things like Kubernetes, DCOS, Docker Swarm. And what they allow you to do, the paradigm that they really provide that's extremely useful is the ability to make deployments to a cluster of machines, tens, hundreds, and treat it as if it's one, right? That way you can say, hey, run this thing, and I don't care. I don't want to manage VMs. I just want to tell you the requirements that I have and let something else worry about it, right? Now, traditionally, spinning up something like that was very difficult, right? I mean, you needed the DevOps master, not a developer who, knows how to modify a configuration file. Like somebody that deeply knows the networking stack and really is a very specific skill. And so what we've seen in the industry, not just Azure, but all cloud providers, is the trend to make these kinds of things, setting them up simpler. So what you could do is I'll say ACS, so our service within Azure is called Azure Container Service, and I'll say create. The name will be demo, and we'll say the orchestrator type is Kubernetes. Now this takes a little while to run, but that's all that it takes to do. Once you've run that command, it's now going to go provision an n number of VM cluster that you can then immediately deploy to. So for the sake of time, I already have one. And so what I'm going to say is ACS, browse, name, fin.js, done. And so what this is going to do is highlight that even though we're using the Azure CLI, it's going to prompt a browser, and what we're actually going to see is the Kubernetes dashboard. And so the benefit of this is that once you've moved beyond that one Azure-specific CLI command, now everything else we're going to do to manage, deploy our applications will be using a skill set that you can carry over to any other environment, right? And so in fact, if we come here and we say, hey, let's go to the services, see this fin.js, external endpoints. Here's that exact same app. And when I deployed this, all I did was specify the name of that Docker container that we used before. It's the exact same one, right? And so that's an example of now here, if I want to go back and say, hey, let's go to the deployment. Let's go to fin.js. Okay. The replica set. And I want to scale this thing out, right? I want to say, hey, let's actually, where is it? One pod running, the deployment. Maybe the UI doesn't show it. But that aside, one thing that's very beneficial about Kubernetes, as I mentioned, right, is that if I want to go say, hey, I want to run 10 copies of this application, and I want to make sure that 2 live on all distinct machines I have in the cluster, or I only want to have 1 on each machine, or I want to run this app, but once it dies, I don't want you to restart it. All these characteristics that you can define declaratively the way that you want to run your application without having to actually manage it, right? And the benefit of that is, once again, that you're getting the skills and the brain power and the influence of the industry as a whole, but with the benefits that we need to move quickly and satisfy the business goals that we all have of how do you have high availability, high scalability, how do we have confident continuous delivery, and so forth and so on. Okay, so let's jump back to the slides. Wow. It will be interesting to see if everyone else doesn't have the same problem. Although there's definitely other Macs here. So with that, I know that was kind of a lot of stuff, but really what I wanted to help illustrate is that concept that, you know, Node.js, JavaScript, full stack development, as being a driving factor of this new wave of cloud native, you know, that's this term, development, is really growing up in a way that is making the skill set of JavaScript even better, right? And so the type of applications that big enterprises, the financial industry need and are building today are becoming more and more well suited by JavaScript, both on the desktop as well as on the server, right? And to me, that's really exciting, right? Because as I mentioned, I've been a JavaScript developer my whole life. It's possible at some time I have to adopt something else, but I really don't want to. And so the more that we see those trends continue and the OSS products, the lack of vendor lock-in, and therefore the breadth of the skill set that you can develop by leveraging those technologies, it's a win-win for everybody, not just companies, but also ourselves, right, our career, right? I mean, I loved some of the points that were made before me that talked about the number of projects that are abandoned because of the lack of skill set, and therefore you could absolutely say that there's a very tangible benefit in being able to reuse existing skill sets and existing ecosystem. And so that's, to me, very exciting. So anyway, some of the stuff that I showed, VS Code, we're very excited to engage more with everyone here. I've had some really great conversations beforehand, and I look to learn more about what you're building and the challenges you're having. Most of everything we work on is open source. So if many of you are already engaging in GitHub, we'd love to also collaborate with you there. And finally, email me. I'm on Twitter. I'm on GitHub. Would also love to hear feedback, even if not here today. So with that, I really appreciate everyone coming out, and I appreciate having the opportunity to speak.